The mercury read 9 degrees below zero. Ice cracked under the weight of a customized John Deere tractor. While the rest of Oak Haven, Nebraska huddled by their fireplaces, 68-year-old Arthur Pendleton was out in the blizzard planting corn. They called him crazy. By harvest, they called him a millionaire. The wind howling across the plains of Oak Haven, Nebraska, was merciless that December. It was the kind of cold that shattered windshields and froze diesel lines solid. Inside the warmly lit diner on Main Street, Hank Mitchell, owner of the local auto repair shop, pressed his face against the frosted glass. He squinted into the whiteout conditions, pointing a calloused finger toward the ridge just 2 miles out of town. "I'm telling you, Toby, he's lost his mind." Hank muttered, his breath fogging the pain. Sheriff Toby Dawson took a slow sip of his black coffee and joined Hank at the window. Through the blinding snow, 2 piercing halogen beams cut through the darkness, moving in perfectly straight, agonizingly slow lines across the frozen expanse of the Pendleton farm. "That's Arthur's John Deere, 8R, Toby said softly, his brow furrowing. "But the ground is solid as concrete. The frost line is 2 feet deep. What in God's name is he doing?" Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a farmer. He was a third-generation institution in Oak Haven. His family had worked those 400 acres since the Great Depression. But the last 3 years had been a brutal succession of tragedies. A historic drought had decimated his yields, a trade war had tanked commodity prices, and worst of all, his wife of 40 years, Martha, had passed away from pancreatic cancer the previous spring. The medical bills, compounded by consecutive crop failures, had left Arthur drowning in $1.2 million of debt to Heartland Regional Bank. The deadline was looming. If Arthur couldn't produce a miracle by the spring harvest, the bank was going to foreclose. And waiting in the wings was Calvin Pierce. Calvin Pierce wasn't a farmer. He was an acquisitions director for Apex Agronomics, a multi-billion-dollar corporate farming conglomerate operating out of Chicago. Pierce drove a matte black Range Rover, wore Italian wool coats, and viewed Oak Haven not as a community, but as a grid of undervalued assets. For months, Pierce had been circling Arthur's land. It was prime real estate, perfectly situated over a massive aquifer, and Pierce intended to pave half of it for an industrial solar array and turn the rest into an automated high-density feedlot. Pierce had already struck a backroom handshake deal with Bradley Gibson, the local loan officer at Heartland Regional. The second Arthur defaulted Apex Agronomics would swoop in, buy the debt for pennies on the dollar, and evict the old man. Everyone in town knew it. Arthur knew it. The stress had visibly aged him. His shoulders stooped, his face weathered into deep ravines. His 32-year-old daughter Clara, a high school biology teacher, had begged him to sell a parcel of the land, take whatever equity was left, and retire. But Arthur refused. And on the night of December 14th, as the worst blizzard of the decade battered the Midwest, he did the unthinkable. Out in the cab of his tractor, the heater was blasting, but Arthur's hands were numb as he gripped the steering wheel. Behind him, he was pulling a heavily modified 24-row planter. Over the past month, working secretly in his barn, Arthur had stripped the factory disc openers and replaced them with heavy-duty tungsten carbide trencher blades, the kind usually reserved for cutting asphalt. He had rigged a specialized pneumatic downforce system, cranking the hydraulic pressure to dangerous levels just to force the blades into the permafrost. The tractor groaned, the engine roaring in protest, as the tungsten blades shattered the frozen topsoil, leaving a jagged, icy trench in their wake. And into that frozen earth, the planter dropped thousands of pale, hard kernels. Suddenly Arthur saw the flashing red and blue lights of a sheriff's cruiser, cutting through the snow, pulling up to the edge of the field. A moment later, Clara's silver Subaru Forester slid to a halt right behind it. Arthur killed the engine and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Clara came trudging through the knee-deep snow, her face pale tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "Dad, stop! Please just stop!" she screamed over the wind. Sheriff Dawson followed close behind, holding his hat to his head. "Arthur, you're scaring folks. You're tearing up your equipment for nothing. The ground is frozen dead. You can't plant corn in December." "The soil is asleep. Clara not dead," Arthur yelled back, his voice surprisingly steady, a strange fire burning in his pale blue eyes. He pointed down at the jagged furrow in the ice. "It's got to be now. The temperature has to drop below 10 degrees, or the seed won't crack." Seat 4, Clara looked down into the icy trench. "Dad, it's Pioneer Hybrid. It'll freeze and rot in 2 days." "It's not Pioneer," Arthur said, turning his back to the wind and climbing back up the steel steps of his tractor. "Go home, Clara. Tell the town whatever they want to hear. But I'm not losing this farm." He slammed the cab door, engaged the PTO, and the massive machine lurched forward again, tearing through the ice. Clara stood shivering in the snow, watching her father drive into the darkness. She was convinced the grief had finally broken his mind. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a stark, blindingly white landscape. And running perfectly parallel across the entirety of the Pendleton farm were the dark, jagged scars of turned, frozen earth. The entire county was whispering. Arthur Pendleton had officially gone mad. By mid-January, Oakhaven was buried under 2 feet of packed snow. The temperatures rarely rose above 20 degrees. Arthur rarely left his farmhouse, except to maintain his equipment. At the local diner, the crazy corn was the only thing anyone talked about. They joked that Arthur was trying to grow popsicles. But in Chicago, Calvin Pierce wasn't laughing. He was impatient. Pierce sat in his corner office, overlooking the icy waters of Lake Michigan, reviewing aerial drone footage of the Pendleton farm. The scarred earth was still visible beneath the snow. Pierce dialed Bradley Gibson at the Heartland Regional Bank. "Bradley, it's Calvin. I want to accelerate the foreclosure." Bradley hesitated on the other end of the line. "Calvin, the legal deadline is April 15th. We can't just seize the land because he's acting eccentric." "It's not eccentricity, it's agricultural negligence," Pierce snapped, citing a little-known clause in standard agricultural loan agreements. The collateral for his loan is the inherent yield value of the land. By ripping up the topsoil during a deep freeze and dumping rotting biomass, which is what those seeds are now, into the furrows, he is actively degrading the soil's nitrogen profile and inviting severe fungal blight come spring. He is destroying the bank's collateral. I want an injunction filed by Friday. Take the land now before he ruins the soil quality for our solar installations. 3 days later, a process server knocked on the door of the Pendleton farmhouse, handing Arthur a thick stack of legal documents. Apex Agronomics, backing the bank, had filed an emergency injunction. A hearing was set for the following Tuesday at the county courthouse. If the judge ruled in the bank's favor, Arthur would be evicted by February 1st. Clara was furious, not at her father, but at the corporate vultures circling him. She took a leave of absence from the high school and moved back into the farmhouse to help him mount a defense. It was then, while searching through his cluttered home office for financial records, that she found the wooden crates stacked in the corner. They were marked with Cyrillic lettering and stamped with the logo of the University of Minnesota's Advanced Agronomy Department. Clara pried one of the crates open. Inside were heavy foil vacuum bags filled with seeds, but they didn't look like any corn seed she had ever seen. They were smaller, incredibly dense, and possessed a strange dark purple hue, almost black. She dug through the paperwork on his desk and found a series of printed emails between her father and Dr. Walter Higgins, a leading genetic soil scientist at the university. Clara burst into the kitchen, where Arthur was quietly nursing a cup of black tea. She slammed the shipping manifest onto the table. "Dad, what is Zeamay's var? Boreal 7, she demanded. Arthur looked up, a slow, tired smile spreading across his weathered face. "You're a biology teacher, Clara. What do you know about cold stratification?" Clara frowned, her scientific training kicking in. "It's a process where certain seeds require a prolonged period of deep freezing temperatures to break their dormancy. It degrades the hard outer shell so they can germinate when it warms up. But that's for pine trees and winter wheat. Corn doesn't have a cold stratification requirement. The moisture in the winter ground causes the endosperm to rot." "Standard corn rots," Arthur corrected her. "But 3 years ago, Doctor, Higgins was part of a team studying indigenous agriculture in the Siberian taiga. They found an ancient localized strain of flint corn that the locals use to plant just before the first snow. Higgins brought the genetics back and crossed it with a high-yield American dent corn. He called it Boreal 7. It has a hyper-thick pericarp, the outer shell. It literally cannot germinate unless it is frozen solid for at least 6 weeks. The freezing water expands, cracking the shell. And when the first spring thaw hits it, doesn't just sprout. It explodes out of the ground, drawing on the immense moisture of the melting snow." Clara stared at him, speechless. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Higgins has never tested it on a commercial scale, only in greenhouses," Arthur said softly. "Apex and the bank wouldn't have let me plant an experimental crop. They would have shut me down in November. I had to make them think I was crazy. A crazy old man is harmless. By the time they realized what I was doing, the seed would already be in the ground." Tuesday arrived. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was packed. Half the town had shown up to watch the spectacle. Calvin Pierce sat at the plaintiff's table, looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers. Arthur sat at the defense table wearing his Sunday church suit, which hung loosely on his thinning frame. Clara sat beside him, clutching a thick binder. Judge Thomas Weaver, a no-nonsense man who had known Arthur for 40 years, peered over his spectacles. "Arthur, the bank is claiming you've engaged in destructive agricultural practices that threaten the collateral of your loan. Mr. Pierce here has provided affidavits from 3 agronomists stating that winter planting destroys soil integrity." Pierce stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, Mr. Pendleton has clearly suffered a tragic mental decline. He has driven heavy machinery through frozen topsoil and planted seeds that are currently rotting beneath 2 feet of snow. We are simply asking the court to step in, execute the foreclosure, and protect the land before irreversible blight sets in." Clara stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Pierce's agronomists are evaluating the wrong crop." She walked forward and placed Dr. Higgins's research papers, the shipping manifests, and a certified letter from the University of Minnesota on the judge's bench. "My father didn't plant standard corn. He planted an experimental, cold-stratified hybrid developed by the University of Minnesota. It requires sub-zero temperatures. The soil isn't being degraded. It is currently acting as a massive natural incubator. My father hasn't broken any agricultural laws, nor has he violated the terms of the loan, which only stipulate that the land must be actively farmed. He is actively farming." Pierce scoffed loudly. "This is absurd magic Siberian corn. Your Honor, they are stalling. By the time this miracle crop fails, the spring planting window will be closed, and the land's value for the year will be 0. Judge Weaver read through the documentation in silence. The courtroom held its breath. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at Calvin Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, I don't pretend to understand Siberian genetics, but I do understand the law. The loan agreement gives Mr. Pendleton until April 15th to satisfy his debt. According to this university letter, this crop should show visible, verifiable germination by the first major thaw, usually late February. The judge banged his gavel. Injunction denied. Mr. Pendleton keeps his land. But, he pointed a stern finger at Arthur, if the snow melts and that field is dead mud, the bank takes possession on March 1st. Court adjourned. As they walked out of the courthouse, Pierce sidled up next to Arthur and Clara. His veneer of polite professionalism was gone. "You bought yourself a month-old man," Pierce sneered. "I'll see you in March. Have your bags packed." The next 4 weeks were agonizing. February brought brutal, biting winds. Clara checked the weather reports obsessively. Dr. Higgins called twice a week, anxious for updates, but there was nothing to report. The fields were a sea of white. Then, on February 24th, the weather broke. A warm front swept up from the Gulf. Over 3 days, temperatures spiked into the high 50s. The snowpack began to melt rapidly, turning the Pendleton farm into a massive, muddy swamp. On the morning of March 1st, Calvin Pierce's matte black Range Rover pulled up to the edge of the farm. Sheriff Dawson's cruiser was right behind him. Pierce stepped out, holding the eviction papers, a triumphant smirk on his face. He walked over to the fence line, staring out at the 400 acres of thick, brown mud. "Nothing," Pierce laughed, looking at the sheriff. "Just like I said. Dead mud." Arthur and Clara walked out of the farmhouse, their boots sinking into the wet earth. "Time's up, Arthur," Pierce called out, waving the papers. "The bet is over. It's my land now." Clara's heart sank. She looked out over the vast expanse of the fields. Pierce was right. There was nothing but mud and the dark scars of the trenches her father had dug in December. The miracle had failed. But Arthur didn't look defeated. He didn't even look at Pierce. He was staring at the ground a few feet past the fence line. He walked past Pierce, unlatched the gate, and waded into the muck. He knelt down in the mud, oblivious to the dirt soaking through his jeans. "Dad!" Clara called out, her voice trembling. "Come here, Clara," Arthur whispered. She climbed through the fence and trudged over to him. Sheriff Dawson and Calvin Pierce followed Pierce, rolling his eyes in annoyance. "Look!" Arthur pointed a trembling, soil-stained finger at the edge of the trench. Clara squinted against the morning sun. At first she saw nothing, but then, pushing up through the freezing mud, cracking the icy crust of the earth, was a tiny needle-like shoot. It wasn't the pale green of normal corn. It was a deep, vibrant, striking purple. Clara gasped, dropping to her knees. She looked down the line of the trench. 10 inches away, another purple shoot. Then another. And another. Sheriff Dawson took off his hat, his eyes widening. As the morning sun crested the ridge illuminating the entire 400-acre field, the optical illusion of the mud faded. The entire farm, row after row, stretching as far as the eye could see, was alive. Millions of dark purple shoots were piercing the frozen earth, standing defiant against the cold. Calvin Pierce dropped his briefcase in the mud, the eviction papers scattered into the dirty water. He stared at the sprawling sea of purple completely and utterly speechless. The news of the purple shoots spread faster than a prairie fire. Within 48 hours, the dirt road leading to the Pendleton farm was lined with pickup trucks. Local farmers who just weeks prior had written Arthur off as a grief-stricken madman stood by the fence line in hushed reverence. Neighboring farmer Jed Miller, who had spent thousands on propane heaters trying to thaw his own fields, could only shake his head as he watched the vibrant purple stalks grow an inch a day, greedily drinking the abundant snowmelt. But Calvin Pierce was not a man who accepted defeat. Humiliated in the mud and facing severe reprimands from his superiors at Apex Agronomics, Pierce shifted his strategy from agricultural law to regulatory sabotage. If he couldn't seize the land for negligence, he would have the state seize the crop as a biohazard. In mid-April, just as the Boreal 7 corn was reaching knee-height, weeks ahead of standard Dent corn, 3 white government SUVs rolled onto Arthur's property. The doors slammed shut, and out stepped Warren Fitch, a senior compliance officer for the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, accompanied by a local deputy and Calvin Pierce himself. Fitch marched up to the farmhouse porch, a red-stamped folder under his arm. Arthur and Clara stepped out to meet them. "Arthur Pendleton, I am issuing a Class 1 agricultural quarantine on this property," Fitch announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "We received a credible tip from Mr. Pierce regarding the cultivation of an unapproved foreign transgenic species. As of this moment, your farm is locked down. If we determine this Siberian strain poses a cross-pollination risk to the county's commercial crops, we will bulldoze and incinerate the entire 400 acres." Clara's blood ran cold. "You can't do that. This is a university-backed trial." "A trial that bypassed state ecological review," Pierce interjected, a smug smile returning to his face. "You introduced an apex invasive species into a major agricultural zone, Clara. It's reckless. The state has no choice." Fitch handed Arthur the quarantine notice. "Nobody enters the fields. My team will take tissue samples today. If the lab finds this pollen is viable for cross-contamination, the tractors roll in on Monday." For 3 days, the Pendleton farm felt like a prison. Clara made dozens of frantic phone calls to Minneapolis, trying to reach Dr. Walter Higgins, but the professor was on a research sabbatical in the Canadian Rockies. The state lab was expediting the DNA testing. Pierce had practically won. He had found the bureaucratic loophole needed to crush the miracle crop. But on Sunday morning, a battered, salt-stained Volvo station wagon came barreling down the driveway, completely ignoring the bright yellow quarantine tape. Out stepped Dr. Higgins, looking disheveled, running on zero sleep, and clutching a massive metallic briefcase. Clara had finally reached him through a satellite phone, and the scientist had driven 14 hours straight from Alberta. When Fitch and Pierce arrived the next morning with a bulldozer idling on the county road, Dr. Higgins was waiting for them on the porch, leaning casually against the railing. "Mr. Fitch," Higgins called out, tapping the metallic briefcase. "Before you ruin a $1 million trial, I suggest you review the cytogenetic sequencing." Fitch frowned. "And you are Dr. Walter Higgins, lead geneticist, University of Minnesota." Higgins unlatched the case and pulled out a stack of dense, peer-reviewed lab reports. "Your lab is looking for cross-pollination risks. You won't find any. Boreal 7 isn't just a cold, stratified hybrid. It is a triploid." Fitch's eyes widened. Pierce looked confused. "Speak English," Pierce demanded. "It means it has 3 sets of chromosomes." "Mr. Pierce," Clara said, realization suddenly dawning on her, a massive smile breaking across her face. "Like a seedless watermelon. It's completely sterile." "Exactly," Higgins confirmed, handing the paperwork to Fitch. "It produces no viable pollen. It cannot cross-pollinate with standard Dent corn. It cannot spread. It is an ecological dead end. Your quarantine is legally baseless." Fitch spent 10 agonizing minutes reading through the genetic reports, verifying the university seals and the cytogenetic charts. Finally he sighed, closed the folder, and looked at Pierce with undisguised annoyance. "The quarantine is lifted," Fitch declared. "Withdraw the bulldozer. Have a good harvest, Mr. Pendleton." As the state vehicles drove away, Calvin Pierce stood alone in the driveway, his face flushed purple with rage. Arthur walked down the porch steps and stopped inches from the corporate acquisitionist. "Get off my land, Calvin," Arthur said softly. "And don't come back." By late August, the Oak Haven landscape was a sea of pale green, but the Pendleton farm was a towering fortress of deep, majestic violet. The Boreal 7 stalks had grown to an astonishing 10 feet tall, thick as oak saplings, completely immune to the late summer dry spells, because their deep root systems had established themselves months before the competition. When September arrived, Arthur fired up his John Deere combine. The entire county seemed to hold its breath as the massive machine chewed into the first rows of the purple giants. The yield monitor in the cab began to flash numbers that defied logic. Standard county yield 175 bushels per acre. Boreal 7, yield 260 bushels per acre. The ears of corn were massive, packed tightly, with hard, dark kernels that gleamed like polished amethyst in the autumn sun. But the true twist wasn't just the sheer volume of the harvest, it was the market value. Standard yellow dent corn was trading at a dismal $4.10 per bushel. The market was saturated, and many farmers were barely breaking even. Calvin Pierce, who had been demoted, but was still monitoring the situation from Chicago, assumed Arthur's weird purple corn would be rejected by the local grain elevators, leaving him with a massive unsellable pile of livestock feed. But Dr. Higgins hadn't just engineered the corn for cold weather. Through his university connections, Higgins had arranged a private assay of the harvested grain. The lab results were staggering. The deep purple pigmentation was the result of anthocyanins' powerful antioxidants. The Boreal 7 strain possessed a nutritional profile and complex starch matrix, unlike anything on the commercial market. Within days of the assay's publication in an agricultural journal, Clara's phone began to ring. It wasn't local feedlots calling. It was international buyers. A bidding war erupted between a major European organic food conglomerate and a high-end American artisanal milling company. They didn't want the corn for ethanol or cattle feed. They wanted it for premium organic health foods, blue corn chips, and specialty flours. On October 12th, Arthur signed an exclusive multi-year sourcing contract with Verdant Naturals. The contracted price $16.50 per bushel. At 260 bushels an acre across 400 acres, Arthur had yielded 104,000 bushels. The gross payout was over $1.7 million. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Arthur Pendleton put on his Sunday suit, drove his muddy pickup truck into Main Street, and walked through the glass doors of Heartland Regional Bank. The lobby went dead silent. He walked straight up to Bradley Gibson's desk. The loan officer looked up his face, pale and sweating. Calvin Pierce, who was sitting in Gibson's office, trying to salvage another predatory deal, froze in his chair. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a cashier's check for $1.2 million, and placed it gently on Gibson's desk. That covers the principal, the interest, and the late fees, Arthur said, his voice calm, echoing through the quiet bank. The farm belongs to the Pendletons. I want the deed released by noon. Bradley Gibson swallowed hard his hands, shaking as he picked up the check. Yes, Arthur. Right away. Arthur turned to look at Calvin Pierce, who was staring at the floor, his corporate arrogance entirely hollowed out. Rumor had it Apex Agronomics was firing him at the end of the quarter for wasting company resources and generating a massive public relations disaster. You know, Calvin, Arthur said, adjusting his cap, you city boys look at a frozen field and just see dead dirt. You forget that in farming, the real work happens in the dark beneath the ice. Arthur walked out of the bank and stepped into the brisk autumn air. Across the street at the diner, Hank Mitchell and Sheriff Dawson were watching through the window. As Arthur gave them a subtle nod, the two men raised their coffee mugs in a silent, respectful toast. He had bet the farm in the dead of winter. And come harvest, the man they called crazy had left the entire county entirely, undeniably speechless. If Arthur's incredible journey of resilience, agricultural brilliance, and sticking it to corporate greed kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We bring you real-life stories of everyday heroes who defy the odds. Don't forget to share this video with friends who love a good comeback story, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true-to-life dramas. Ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling upload.